I filed the bearing report on a Tuesday in the 11th month of the survey rotation, in the same flat administrative tone I used for everything else: anomalous repeating signal. Frequency band outer survey 7, bearing 274 mark -18 from the Kethavar buoy. Signal strength consistent. Modulation pattern non-random. Origin estimated at 11 light-years. I attached the waveform log, flagged it as potentially archaeological, and sent it to Captain Serovansky with a priority marker 1 step above routine. I did not expect her to act on it. I had been logging the signal for 11 months at that point. It had been there when I first opened the passive receive array during our initial survey sweep of the Kethavar corridor, sitting quietly in the background behind all the natural interference, a layered looping transmission that repeated on a cycle of approximately 9 hours and 14 minutes. Give or take the drift that accumulates when a transmitter has been running on residual power for a very long time. The first time I noticed it, I spent 40 minutes trying to classify it as instrument noise. It wasn't. The second time I looked at it, I cross-checked it against every known beacon standard in the Colonial Authority Registry, the Teshari Exchange Database, the Outer Veth Signal Archive, and the Unified Catalog of Natural Radio Emitters compiled by the Halvan Passage Observatory. It matched none of them. The third time I looked at it, I set up a dedicated monitoring channel and let it run. I am a junior cartographer. My formal responsibilities aboard the EGS Karev's Passage are the mapping of stellar bodies, the documentation of navigational hazards, and the maintenance of the passive receive array that we use to locate survey targets. Anomalous signals are technically within my remit, only to the extent that I am supposed to log them and pass them up. What I am not supposed to do is spend 11 months building a detailed spectral profile of an unidentified repeating transmission from an unknown source 11 light-years outside our assigned survey corridor. I did it anyway. By the time I filed the bearing report, I knew the signal well enough to tell you things about it that no automated classifier would have caught. I knew that the 9-hour cycle was actually 3 distinct subsequences layered on top of one another, each broadcasting on a slightly different modulation depth, as though the original system had been designed with redundancy in mind. 3 transmitters cycling in near synchrony, close enough to overlap into what looked like a single source at distance, far enough apart in frequency to still be distinguishable if you looked carefully. I knew that the layering was not random and not natural, because natural sources do not produce the kind of nested harmonic spacing that I was seeing, and random emitters do not repeat to within a margin of 11 milliseconds across cycles that span 9 hours. I knew that the signal had been running long enough for its carrier wave to show the kind of subtle frequency drift that comes from a power source, degrading over geological time, not years, not decades, not centuries. The drift curve, when I modeled it backward against known decay profiles for solid-state power cells of various chemistries, pointed to an origins somewhere between 35,000 and 45,000 years ago. I wrote that figure in the bearing report in the same flat tone I used for everything else. Estimated broadcast origin, 35 to 45,000 years prior to present. Signal characteristics consistent with automated emergency relay network, multi-tower array, residual power operation. I attached all 11 months of waveform logs. I sent it to Captain Vane on a Tuesday. She called me to the command deck on Thursday. The Karev's Passage is a Colonial Authority geological survey vessel, which means it is not large, not fast, and not particularly armed. It carries a crew of 22 and enough equipment to conduct detailed surface surveys of rocky bodies across a survey corridor roughly 40 light-years in diameter. What it also carries, because Colonial Authority survey vessels have been operating in contested and undefined space long enough that the Authority's procurement division developed certain habits, is a pulse array defense installation behind a panel on the port hull that officially does not appear on the civilian vessel registry and unofficially can make life very unpleasant for anything that decides to investigate us too closely. I mention this not because it turned out to be relevant, but because it is part of what made Captain Vane's decision possible. We were not entirely without resources. She was standing at the main display table when I arrived. My bearing report projected in front of her, alongside a star chart I recognized as the Outer Kethavar extension, the region beyond our assigned corridor, where the colonial authorities' survey coverage thinned out and eventually gave way to charted, but uninspected, space. She had my waveform logs open in a secondary panel. She had been reading them. She did not look up when I came in, she said. 11 months, I said. Yes, Captain, she said. You've been running a dedicated monitoring channel on this for 11 months, and you're filing it now, I said. I wanted to have sufficient data to characterize the signal before reporting. The drift modeling required a minimum of 8 months of continuous observation to produce a statistically meaningful origin estimate. She looked up at that. She has the kind of face that does not signal much. It was one of the first things I noticed about her when I came aboard. The quality of stillness in her expression, the way she processes things without showing the processing. She looked at me for a moment and then looked back at the waveform logs. She said, 40,000 years, I said. The midpoint of the estimated range. Yes. She was quiet for a while. Outside the viewport behind her, the Kethavar corridor extended in every direction, bright with the cold particular light of this part of the outer reach, the kind of light that has traveled a long way and carries that distance in its quality. I had learned to read the light out here over 11 months. It had a patience to it. It did not seem like the light of a place where things were supposed to happen quickly, she said. The signal is still active, I said. Yes, it was active as of the last monitoring cycle 41 minutes ago. The signal strength is consistent with what I've been logging since I first detected it. There is no indication of decay or interruption in the broadcast, she said. A transmitter running on residual power for 40,000 years, I said. 3 transmitters most likely, given the layered subsequences. Probably more. The spectral profile is consistent with a distributed network rather than a single installation. Multi-tower relay arrays are more resilient than single-point emitters. If you build enough of them across a planet's surface, and they are constructed to a sufficient standard of durability, the network continues to function long after individual towers fail. The surviving towers pick up the load. She looked at the chart. I could see her calculating the bearing, the distance, the deviation from our assigned survey corridor. 11 light-years is not a trivial detour for a vessel on a scheduled rotation. It is the kind of deviation that requires a log entry and a formal justification and a communication to the Colonial Authority Regional Coordinator, who would then have opinions about it. Survey rotations run on budget cycles. Budget cycles are not sympathetic to 11 light-year detours, she said. What do you think it is? I said. I think it is the automated emergency relay network of a civilization that no longer exists. I think they built it to broadcast a distress signal in the event of a catastrophic event, a planetary emergency, a civilization-ending crisis of some kind. And I think the catastrophe happened, and I think the network did exactly what it was built to do. It broadcast the signal. It kept broadcasting it. It is still broadcasting it. No one came. She was quiet for longer this time, I said. I want to be precise about that last part. I have no way to determine whether anyone came in the first few centuries after the broadcast began. It is possible that the civilization had allies, partners, neighboring species, and that some of them responded, and that all of those responses occurred and concluded long before any human being existed anywhere in this part of the galaxy. What I can tell you is that as of 41 minutes ago, the network is still broadcasting, and I have found no record in any archive I have access to of anyone acknowledging that signal or acting on it within recorded history. In recorded history, which is relative to 40,000 years, a very small window, no one answers. She said, until now, I said. That depends on whether we go. She closed the secondary panel. She looked at the bearing on the chart for another moment. Then she said, file the deviation request with the coordinator's office. Use my authorization code. Tell them we have a potential archaeological site of significant historical interest, and we are adjusting our survey path to investigate. That is accurate, I said. Yes, Captain, she said. Oral, I stopped at the hatchway, she said. Good work. I went back to my station and filed the deviation request. The coordinator's office acknowledged it in 4 hours with a pro forma approval and a reminder that deviation costs were subject to post-rotation audit. I noted the acknowledgement, filed the audit notice, and went back to listening to the signal. It kept broadcasting, 9 hours and 14 minutes, plus or minus 11 milliseconds. 3 layered subsequences, nested harmonics, frequency drift consistent with 40,000-year residual power operation. Whatever had built those towers had built them to last. Whatever catastrophe had triggered the network had happened so long ago that the geology of the originating world had in all probability changed substantially since then. I thought about that sometimes during the transit. 11 days at survey cruise, which is not fast, what the world would look like when we arrived. Whether there would be anything left to see beyond the towers themselves. I spent the transit days working the lower channel of the signal more aggressively than I had during the rotation. The broadcast layer, the top layer, the one that had been reaching 11 light years, was already well characterized. But I had spent the last 4 months of the rotation trying to extract something from the modulation of the deepest subsequence, the one I had initially classified as transmitter hardware interference. It was not interference. I had become increasingly certain of that over those 4 months without being able to prove it to a standard I was comfortable filing. The pattern was too structured for noise, too low bandwidth for the kind of data a broadcast would carry, too persistent across 41,000 years for anything that wasn't deeply intentional. During the transit, I ran the inference engine on every cycle I had accumulated, and I pushed the translation parameters as far as the engine would go. Without generating artifacts I couldn't distinguish from real signal. By the time we came out of transit, I had 17% of the lower channel decoded. That was enough to tell me it was a data channel. That was enough to tell me it was structured. That was not enough to tell me what it contained, but the structure itself was meaningful. It had the architecture of a record rather than a message, organized rather than addressed, the kind of thing you make when you are not sending to a specific recipient, but preserving for whoever might eventually come. I kept that to myself during the transit. I did not want to make claims I could not yet support. There was more than I expected when we arrived. We came out of transit on a Thursday, which felt appropriate to me in a way I could not have articulated at the time. And what we found on the passive sensors was a world that had not been dead as long as the geology of catastrophe usually implies. I had expected a scoured rock, tectonically reshaped, any surface features from the civilization's era ground away by the ordinary processes of 40,000 years. What we found instead was a world in the late stages of a recovery that had been going on for most of those 40,000 years. Planet that had been devastated, certainly, the evidence of that written into the crust density readings and the atmospheric chemistry and the scarring visible on the continental margins even from orbit. But a world that had been recovering from the devastation slowly, in the way that worlds do when no one is interfering with the process. There were oceans, small ones, shallow but real. There was an atmosphere, thin, oxygen poor by Earth standards, but not nothing. There was weather. There was a hydrological cycle. There was, on the equatorial landmasses, something that the biological survey package identified as ground cover vegetation. Simple, low, the kind of thing that moves in when conditions allow and holds the soil and changes the chemistry and makes room for whatever comes next. 40,000 years had been enough time for the most basic things to begin again. And there were the towers. I found 47 of them on the first orbital pass using the active survey array. They were distributed across 3 of the 4 major landmasses in a pattern that looked, when I mapped it, like a deliberate network, not clustered, Not random, but spaced in a way that maximized coverage of the hemisphere facing the outer reach, the hemisphere that would broadcast most effectively in the direction of whatever neighbors this civilization had known. They were tall. Even at orbital resolution, I could see that they were tall. Structures that had been built to project, built to be durable, built to keep working after whoever built them was gone. 47 towers in 11 months of continuous operation, and the signal was still reaching 11 light-years to where I had been sitting with my passive receive array and my monitoring channel. That is what I mean when I say they built them to last. Captain Vane brought us into low orbit, and we began the standard documentation sequence: spectral mapping, surface imaging, atmosphere sampling, gravitational survey. I ran the signal analysis in parallel, triangulating between the tower positions I had identified, confirming the network architecture, building a picture of how the relay system had been designed. The first day in orbit was mostly instruments and silence. There is a particular quality to arriving at a place no one has visited, that you know of, that history records, where the ordinary survey work carries an extra weight because every measurement is the first one anyone has taken. The atmospheric chemistry profile was the first. The crust density mapping was the first. The surface temperature distribution was the first. I logged all of them in the standard format, which is the format that does not account for weight, and I noticed myself adding notes to entries that did not normally require notes, trying to capture context that the data fields had no column for. On the second day, I had all 47 tower positions confirmed and began the network architecture analysis in earnest. It was elegant. I do not use that word lightly. I use it in the engineering sense. It was a solution that achieved its purpose with the minimum necessary complexity, designed by people who understood what they were building and why, who had anticipated failure modes and built around them. The distributed architecture was intentional. The nested frequency layering was intentional. The spacing of the towers across the 3 landmasses was not the spacing that maximized planetary coverage in the general sense. It was the spacing that maximized directional broadcast efficiency toward a specific region of the outer reach, the region from which the nearest technological civilizations, if any existed, would most likely observe. They had oriented the network outward toward the most probable directions of contact, while maintaining enough redundancy across landmasses to survive regional geological disruption. That detail stayed with me. They had designed the network to survive the kind of event that had destroyed the civilization that built it. The network was still standing because they had understood when they built it that it would have to outlast the catastrophe. They had built survival into the infrastructure because they had understood they would not survive personally to maintain it. Even the specific broadcast band they had chosen, the band that had placed their signal squarely in the range covered by Earth's colonial authority, passive receive standard, a standard that had not existed when those towers were built, was, if not intentional in a specific sense, then the product of the same reasoning that any civilization working in this part of the electromagnetic spectrum would arrive at. The same band that works for emergency broadcasts across the physics of this part of the galaxy is the same band that works for emergency broadcasts, regardless of what species is doing the broadcasting, because the underlying electromagnetic physics does not care about species. They had not aimed at Earth specifically. They had not aimed at anyone specifically. They had aimed at the band that anyone listening would be most likely to monitor. They had aimed the signal at no one in particular. They had aimed it at whoever might be there to receive it. We were there. On the 3rd day in orbit, I found the record. It was in the modulation of the deepest layer of the signal, not the top layer, which was the repeating emergency broadcast, the equivalent of a distress beacon, the part that had been reaching out for 40,000 years, but the lower layer, the one I had initially classified as background interference from the transmitter hardware itself. It was not interference. It was a separate data channel, much lower bandwidth than the emergency broadcast, running at a rate that required patient demodulation to extract anything useful. It had taken 11 months of continuous monitoring to accumulate enough cycles of that lower layer to have material to work with, and another 4 months of work during the rotation, and the 11 days of transit with the inference engine running at full capacity. When I finally cracked the encoding schema, and I want to be precise about this, because it was not a breakthrough moment, it was the result of 4 months of incremental work and 7 approaches that didn't pan out before the 8th one did. What I found was a record, not a call for help, not a message to any specific recipient, a record. It was the kind of thing a civilization encodes when it knows it is ending and wants to make sure that something survives. It contained what I eventually understood to be population data, not names, but counts. And the counts were very large, and then very small, and then 0. It contained what I eventually understood to be a chronicle of the catastrophe itself, not narrative, because narrative requires a storyteller and a story takes time, and they did not have time, but data, the raw instrumental record of what happened to their world as the network had watched it happen. I could read the atmospheric chemistry changes. I could read the seismic records. I could read what looked like the records of attempts to address the catastrophe. Large-scale engineering, responses if I was reading the data correctly, and then the cessation of those attempts, which told its own story. I could read the final entries, which were very short and very dense, and which I could not fully decode because I was working without a translation framework, and what I had was an inference engine and 11 months of signal analysis, not a linguistic key. But I could read enough. I knew what had happened to them. I knew roughly when and roughly how, and I knew that the towers had been built in the final period, when it was clear that nothing was going to stop what was coming, and that whoever had built those towers had made a deliberate choice not to spend their last resources on something that might save themselves, but on something that would outlast them and carry their record forward. They had built a transmitter network designed to last 40,000 years because they had wanted someone, eventually, to know. I sat with that for a long time before I said anything to anyone. What I felt was not grief precisely. I had not known them. They had been gone for 40,000 years. There was nothing to grieve in the immediate sense. What I felt was closer to the thing you feel when you understand the full weight of a decision that someone else made a very long time ago, and you understand that the decision was made in the knowledge that no one who made it would ever know whether it worked. They built those towers without knowing if anyone would ever receive the signal. They built them knowing they would not survive to find out. They did it anyway. I thought that was worth acknowledging. I wrote up my findings in a preliminary analysis report and sent it to Captain Vane, and then I went to her in person, because some things warrant a face-to-face conversation. She read the preliminary report while I sat across from her in the command cabin. It is a small room. The Karev's passage is not a large ship. She read it the way she reads everything, without visible reaction. And when she was done, she set the reader down and looked at the viewport, where the limb of the planet was just visible at the edge of the frame, thin atmosphered and gray-brown, and covered with its slow recovering vegetation and its 47 towers still broadcasting. She said, "They left a record." I said, "Yes, in the lower data channel. I've been able to decode roughly 17% of it with the inference engine. The rest will take more time and probably a more sophisticated translation framework than I have available. But the broad outline is clear." She said, "What do you want to do?" I said. "I want to go down." She looked at me. I said, "I want to access one of the towers directly. If the relay network is still functioning, there may be a local interface, something designed for maintenance access, for a ground team to connect to the system without broadcasting. If I can access the local interface, I may be able to retrieve a more complete version of the record. The broadcast version is limited by bandwidth. A direct connection might give me the full archive," she said. "The atmosphere is oxygen poor," I said. "Suits. It's well within our operational range." she said. We're a geological survey vessel, I said. We have a shuttle, 2 geological sample rovers, full suit inventory, and a signal analysis package that has already decoded 17% of a 40,000-year-old transmission in a language no human being has ever encountered before. I'm not saying it will be easy. I'm saying it's possible. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Who do you want with you?" I said. "Specialist Theron for the geological assessment. I'll need someone who can read the surface stability before I approach any of the towers. Technician Avesh for the hardware interface. If there's a local access port, I need someone who can work with physical connectors. And you, if you're willing." She raised an eyebrow at that. I said, "You're the captain. If I find the full archive, the decision about what to do with it shouldn't be mine alone." She said, "Fair point." She looked at the planet again. "Tomorrow morning. Get Theron and Avesh briefed tonight," I said. "Yes, Captain," she said. "Oral," she paused. "What do you think you're going to find down there?" I thought about it. I said, "I think I'm going to find a very old building that was designed very carefully by people who wanted to make sure that when someone finally came, they would be able to take what had been left for them. I think the local interface is going to be accessible. I think they anticipated this moment," she said. "A 40,000-year-old building on a world that went through a geological catastrophe, in an atmosphere that's been cycling through recovery for most of those 40,000 years." I said, "Yes," she said. "And you think the local interface is going to be accessible?" I said. "Captain, they built transmitters that are still broadcasting after 40,000 years. I think they gave a great deal of thought to durability." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Get some sleep." I went to sleep. In the morning, we went down. The shuttle landing took 40 minutes because Theron made us do 3 full low-altitude passes over the target tower before she was willing to sign off on the approach. She is very good at her job. The tower sat on what had once been a coastal plain. The topography told us that clearly, and the coastal plain had experienced subsidence in the geological event that had restructured the planet's surface. The ground around the tower had dropped perhaps 3 meters, relative to where it had stood when the tower was built. But the tower itself was planted on a foundation that went deep enough that the subsidence had not materially affected its structural integrity. It was still vertical. It was still whole. I had been looking at it on the survey imagery for 3 days. I had built up a detailed picture of its proportions and materials from spectral analysis. None of that fully prepared me for standing next to it. It was approximately 45 meters tall, which is not, by the engineering standards of any civilization I am aware of, particularly large. But there is something about standing at the base of a structure that was built 40,000 years ago and is still standing, still functioning, still broadcasting its signal into the void, that changes the scale of it. The materials were dark, a composite I couldn't immediately identify, dense, with a surface texture that had weathered over the millennia, but had not significantly degraded. The base flared outward, a broad footing that distributed the load across a wide area. The upper section narrowed to the antenna array at the top, which was intact. I could see the subtle shimmer of the broadcast field if I looked at it from the right angle against the sky. The sky was strange, thin as expected, and the light came through it with a particular quality. Flatter than Earth daylight, more diffuse, less saturated. The recovering ground cover vegetation spread away from the tower in every direction, low and gray-green, moving slightly in a wind that I could feel through my suit. It was quiet, not silent. The wind made sounds, and the suit's external microphones picked up a low harmonic that was almost certainly the tower itself, the physical vibration of the broadcast array, a frequency so low it was more felt than heard, but quiet in the sense that nothing else was making noise. There were no animals. There were no other structures visible from where I stood. There was the tower and the wind and the vegetation and the sky, and 40,000 years of nothing else. I stood there for longer than was strictly efficient. I am aware of that. Theron was already moving to set up her stability instrumentation, and Avesh was walking the perimeter of the base. And I was standing at the foot of the tower looking up at it, thinking about the decision that had been made in this place. Or a place very much like it, this or one of the other 46 towers across 3 landmasses, at the end of everything, when the people building it had known they would not live to see whether it worked. The surface under my boots was not what I had expected. Theron's stability scans had shown it was consolidated, competent ground, and it was, but it was also old in a way that even geological survey work does not often produce contact with. The subsidence had lowered it 3 meters from its original level, but the compaction told a story of millennia of slow settling, of rain and freeze and chemical weathering working at the pace of recovery rather than destruction. I was standing on ground that had been catastrophically disrupted 40,000 years ago, and had spent most of those 40,000 years becoming ground again. The vegetation was fine under my boots, dry and tough, the kind of plant life that exists at the frontier of where life is possible and holds that frontier by being durable rather than lush. The tower rose above me in the diffuse light, and I looked up at the antenna array and thought, it is still working. After all of this, the catastrophe, the geological disruption, the 40,000 years of weather and temperature cycling and slow atmospheric recovery, it is still working. The signal was still being generated inside that structure, still being fed to that array, still being broadcast outward toward the outer reach where, 11 light-years away, a junior cartographer on a geological survey vessel had been listening with a passive receive array and a monitoring channel he had set up because the signal was too structured to be natural. I have thought about that many times since. The chain of contingency between the decision to build the towers and the moment I stood at the base of one, the number of things that had to go a particular way for that chain to hold. The 11 months I had spent on the survey rotation, which was itself a deviation from a previous rotation I had been scheduled for and had been reassigned away from for administrative reasons I had found frustrating at the time. The passive receive array that I maintained, which was technically optional equipment on a geological survey vessel, which Captain Vane had kept operational because she had the habit of not discarding useful capability, regardless of whether current operational orders required it. The specific survey corridor assignment that had put the Karev's passage in the Kethavar region rather than one of several other corridors we might have drawn. The bearing 274 mark -18, which pointed toward the outer reach in exactly the direction the towers had been aimed. None of those contingencies had been controlled by whoever built the towers. They had controlled what they could control: the signal strength, the band selection, the broadcast duration design, the archive architecture, the maintenance access port. Everything else had been trust, the same word I kept coming back to. They had trusted the chain of contingency to eventually produce someone standing at the base of one of their towers. Here I was. I have thought about that many times since. The chain of contingency between the decision to build the towers and the moment I stood at the base of one. Theron came around after a few minutes and reported that the foundation integrity was sound across the full perimeter. No subsidence risk, stable for ground operations of any reasonable duration. She said it in the matter-of-fact way she says everything, and then looked up at the tower herself for a moment before going back to her instruments. I noted that she looked for longer than the structural assessment required. Avesh and I walked the perimeter while Theron finished her instrument work. I was looking for the maintenance access that I had predicted would be there. I found it on the south face, a panel, recessed, with a geometry that was clearly intentional, clearly designed for access rather than structural. The panel had a covering that had partially corroded away, revealing the connection interface beneath. The interface was not a standard colonial authority connector. It was not a Tessari connector or a Veth connector, or any connector in the Exchange database I had access to. It was something I had never seen. I studied it for several minutes before calling Avesh over. The geometry was clean, not ornamental, not complex, but specific in the way that functional hardware is specific, every angle and recess with a purpose. There were 4 contact points, and a central channel that I eventually understood was a keying feature, a physical guide to ensure proper orientation during connection. The contact surfaces were oxidized but intact beneath the oxidation. 40,000 years of atmospheric cycling had produced a superficial layer of corrosion, but the base material had resisted. Whatever they had built the interface from, they had chosen it for exactly this. For the long wait, for the unknown visitor, for the day when someone with different hands and different tools would need to make contact, and the interface would have to still be there to receive them. I thought, standing there with Avesh at my shoulder, about the engineer who had specified that material, who had sat in the final period, with everything ending, and had made a deliberate choice about corrosion resistance on a maintenance access port that would never be used by anyone they knew, on a timeline they could not specify, in an environment that would change in ways they could not fully predict. That engineer had done their job completely. That was the only conclusion available. They had done their job as though it mattered, because it did matter, and now, 40,000 years later, I was standing at the result. Captain Vane had come around the base to where we were. She looked at the interface, and then at Avesh, and then at me. She said, "They built an access port." I said, "Yes." She said, "Who were they building it for?" I said, "For whoever came." I looked up at the tower, the antenna array visible against the flat, gray-brighted sky. They didn't know who would come. They built the port so that whoever it was would be able to connect. She was quiet for a while after that. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the tower, and I did not interrupt the silence because there was nothing useful to add to it. There was only the wind and the harmonic of the broadcast and the recovering vegetation and the sky, and the 4 of us standing at the base of a thing that had been waiting longer than human civilization had existed. Avesh crouched down and looked at the interface for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "I can make an adapter," I said. "Out of what?" he said. "Out of what I have." He opened his tool pack. "Give me 40 minutes. Avesh took 37 minutes. The adapter he built was, from a materials science perspective, a remarkable improvisation, a bridging connector fabricated from components in his tool pack and 2 modules cannibalized from the geological survey sensors, matched to the interface geometry by careful measurement and more careful cutting, with a signal conversion circuit built in to translate between whatever protocol the tower used and the signal analysis package on my portable unit. He plugged it into the interface with the careful precision of a man who has learned to handle irreplaceable things gently. And then he stepped back and nodded to me. I connected my analysis unit. The first thing that happened was that the local network recognized the connection and stopped treating my unit as an unaffiliated external receiver. There was a handshake, not a standard handshake, but something functionally equivalent. A negotiation between my signal analysis package and the tower's local control system that took about 4 minutes and required me to make several manual adjustments to the translation parameters. The tower's system was patient. It waited each time I adjusted. It did not time out. Whatever timeout threshold the designers had built in, it was set generously. They had understood that whoever connected might need time to negotiate the protocol. When the handshake completed, the data began to transfer. I had estimated, based on the bandwidth of the broadcast signal and the fraction of the record I had decoded, that the full archive was probably something in the range of several hundred times larger than what the broadcast channel carried. I was low by approximately a factor of 3. What came across in the local connection was not just larger. It was structured in a way that the broadcast version was not, organized rather than compressed, with what appeared to be an index and cross-reference architecture built into it. They had designed the broadcast version to be receivable at a distance, to be decodable by someone who didn't know the encoding schema, to be something that could be picked up and reconstructed by an outside party with patience and inference tools. They had designed the local version to be readable once you got close enough to connect. A full archive, properly organized, with the structural metadata intact to make it tractable. They had thought about both cases. They had thought about the case where someone received the signal from far away and decoded it partially, and they had thought about the case where someone traveled to the source and connected directly. They had provided for both. They had, in other words, thought about me specifically, not me by name, not my species, not my technology level, or my connector standard or my language, but the abstract category I represented, the one who received the signal at a distance and came and needed to connect. They had built the system for that person. I was that person. It fit. The transfer took 2 hours and 9 minutes. When it was complete, I ran a preliminary integrity check and found that the archive was intact, not partially, not mostly, but entirely, within the error margins of the transfer. 40,000 years of broadcast operation, 40,000 years of wind and weather and geological recovery, and the local archive had survived undegraded. I do not have adequate words for what that implies about the engineering standards of whoever built those towers. I will simply say that they were very good at what they did, and that they had understood what they were doing. Captain Vane was standing behind me. She had been watching the transfer progress without speaking for most of the last 2 hours. When the integrity check completed, she said, "Is it what you expected?" I said, "It's more than I expected." The broadcast version was a summary. This is the complete record. Population data, event chronicle, technical documentation of their response efforts, cultural archives. At least, that's what the index suggests. I won't be able to read most of it for a long time. The translation framework I've built will handle the scientific and administrative data, but the cultural material is going to take years, maybe decades, with a proper linguistic team working on it. She said, "But you have it." I said, "We have it." She looked at the tower. The wind moved across the vegetation. The low harmonic of the broadcast continued, felt more than heard. She said, "What do we do now?" I had been thinking about that since the transfer began. I said, "We log it. We file the archive with the Colonial Authority Archaeological Records Division. We flag the relay network as active heritage infrastructure under the Colonial Authority Cultural Preservation Act, which will prevent any future survey or extraction operation from interfering with the towers. We send a preliminary report to the Outer Passage Academic Consortium, because this is going to need the attention of people with more specialized translation resources than I have, and then we go." She looked at me. I said, "The signal will keep broadcasting whether we're here or not. It has been broadcasting for 40,000 years without us. It doesn't need us to stay. What it needed was for someone to come and connect and receive what was left. We did that. The rest is record keeping and scholarship. And we're a geological survey vessel on a deviated course with an audit notice on our deviation costs." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Is there anything else you need from the tower before we go?" I thought about it carefully because I wanted to be sure. I said, "One thing." She waited. I said, "I want to send an acknowledgement," she said. "An acknowledgement," I said, "through the local interface. A confirmation of receipt, logged to the network's internal record. I don't know if the network has a logging function. I haven't looked at that part of the architecture yet. But if it does, I want to put a timestamp on it. The signal has been broadcasting since before human civilization existed. The least we can do is note in the record that someone received it." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved. The tower hummed. She said, "Can the network receive an inbound signal? You said it was built for broadcast." I said, "I don't know yet. I'm going to find out." It took me another 40 minutes to find the answer, and the answer was yes. The network had been built with a receive function, which was dormant, which I was able to activate through the local interface. The receive function had a logging architecture, a timestamp system, which had been running and recording elapsed time since broadcast initiation. which told me that the network knew how long it had been broadcasting. The timestamp counter read 41,217 years, 4 months, 11 days, and some hours. I did not convert the hours. The number was large enough. I composed an acknowledgement. I kept it brief because I was not sure how much of it would be interpretable by anyone who might access this record later, and I did not want to clutter the log with things that would not survive translation. I wrote, Earth Colonial Survey Vessel Karev's Passage, bearing 274 Mark -18 from the Kethavar buoy, Outer Survey 7 band passive receive, 11 light years. Signal received. Archive received. We were here. I transmitted it through the local interface at the tower's receive input, where it logged to the network's internal record with the timestamp counter, reading 41,217 years, 4 months, 11 days. We disconnected. Avesh removed the adapter carefully and stowed it. We walked back to the shuttle. Theron had already completed her surface stability documentation and was running a final instrument check. Captain Vane and I walked in silence for a while, the ground cover vegetation moving around our feet in the wind, the tower receding behind us. She said, "Do you think they would have wanted to know that someone came?" I said. "Yes, I think that was the whole point," she said. 41,000 years, I said. The timestamp counter was running. They built it to count. I think they wanted whoever came to know how long the signal had been waiting. She did not say anything else until we were aboard the shuttle. Theron lifted us off cleanly, and as we climbed, I looked down through the viewport at the tower, growing small, surrounded by its gray-green vegetation and its shallow recovered landscape, still broadcasting, the faint shimmer of the antenna array just visible against the diffuse sky. 46 of its siblings were invisible from this angle, distributed across the other land masses, doing the same thing they had been doing for 41,000 years. The signal was still going out, still reaching 11 light years to where an Earth survey vessel had been sitting with its passive receive array, still broadcasting on the same band to whoever might be there to receive it. We reached orbit. Captain Vane called the crew together in the main compartment to brief them on what we'd found. Not all of it, not the full scale of the archive, but the broad outline, enough for them to understand what they were part of. She did it matter-of-factly, without ceremony, in the way she does everything, and when she was done, she said, "Oral is going to need processing time on the main computer for the archive work. Accommodate that. We break for the transit lane in 6 hours. Questions?" There were a few questions. She answered them. The crew went back to their stations. I went to my station and began the preliminary processing run on the archive. Not to read it, not yet, but to structure it, to prepare it for the transfer to the Colonial Authority Records Division and the Academic Consortium, to make sure that what we had received was intact and organized in a way that would allow the people who came after us to work with it. That is also a kind of work. That is the work that comes after the signal is received. The work of making sure the record survives another generation forward. I worked through the transit out of the system and through most of the 11. Day returned to the Kethavar buoy. The archive was large enough that the preliminary structure work alone took the better part of 5 days. On the 6th day, I allowed myself to begin reading in earnest. Not the cultural material, which requires linguistic resources I do not have, but the scientific and administrative sections, which the inference engine could handle with greater confidence. What I found in those sections filled in the picture significantly beyond what the broadcast channel had given me. The population data was more granular than I had expected. Not just counts, but distributions, geographic spread, age structure, the kinds of records that a functioning administrative apparatus maintains as a matter of course, and that this one had continued to maintain until very near the end. The counts had been very large. They had covered multiple sites across the planet's surface, which told me the civilization had been spacefaring at a regional scale, if not a broader one. They had had colonies or outposts, or at minimum the capacity to sustain populations at multiple locations simultaneously. Then the counts had declined. The decline was not slow. The decline was the kind of decline that a geological catastrophe produces. Not war, not disease, not political collapse, but a physical event of planetary scale that overwhelmed every response capability they had. The engineering records documented the responses in the same flat data register tone as the population counts, and the responses were, by any measure, remarkable. Massive atmospheric intervention programs, seismic damping arrays, emergency relocation operations moving populations away from the worst affected regions. They had fought it. They had fought it with everything they had, and the data told clearly how far that got them, and when it stopped getting them anywhere, and what they had done instead. They had built the towers. I read the construction records on the 7th day of the transit. It was dry material, in the sense that construction records are always dry material. Material specifications, structural load calculations, power system documentation, network architecture diagrams rendered in a notation I could only partially interpret. But the dates told the story that the technical material did not. The construction program had begun while the population counts were still declining, while the engineering response programs were still running, while there were still enough people alive and organized and motivated to undertake a project of this scale. They had started building the towers before the outcome was certain, while there was still something worth saving, and they had finished the network in the final period when the outcome was no longer in question. They had built the network for the future while the present was ending. That is what the dates told me. I read them once and then sat for a while without reading anything else. On the 8th day, I found the section I had suspected might be there. The documentation of the broadcast design decisions. The engineering choices had not been accidental. The frequency band had been chosen specifically because it was the band most likely to be monitored by any technological civilization capable of receiving it. Not because they knew which civilization that might be, but because the band selection criteria were based on physics that any technological civilization would encounter, and the engineers had reasoned that any technological civilization encountering those physics would likely make similar choices about monitoring. It was not a message aimed at anyone. It was a message aimed at the class of entities capable of receiving it. The maintenance access ports had been included in the original design specifications. The specification document was brief on this point, a single paragraph, but clear. The ports had been designed with the expectation that the interface standard would be unknown to whoever eventually accessed them. The design requirement was therefore to make the physical connection as simple and geometrically unambiguous as possible, so that any technician with any connector fabrication capability could improvise a working adapter. The target for the physical interface design had been accessible to anyone with tools and patience. Avesh had needed 37 minutes and the contents of his tool pack. I considered that a reasonable validation of the design requirement. I sent the consortium team a partial results note on the 9th day, flagging the construction records as particularly significant. They responded within 6 hours. A translation team was already being assembled. They asked if I would be willing to consult on an ongoing basis. I said yes. We reached the Kethavar buoy on a Thursday. I filed the preliminary report with the Colonial Authority Records Division and the academic consortium simultaneously, with the archive transfer flagged for priority handling. I filed the Heritage Infrastructure Designation request for the relay network with the Colonial Authority Cultural Preservation Division. I filed the geological survey data from Theron's surface work, because we are a geological survey vessel, and that is part of our job, and the surface data was genuinely useful. The recovery rate of the planet's biosphere was something the academic consortium would want to model, and the subsidence mapping around the tower sites would inform any future groundwork at the location. I filed the deviation cost documentation for the audit. It was, I noted in the accompanying memo, Within the colonial authorities' existing provision for unplanned archaeological investigation, which caps deviation costs at a certain threshold before requiring additional authorization, and our deviation costs came in below that threshold by a margin I was pleased to note. Captain Vane had approved the wording of the memo. She had added one line to the justification section which read, "The site is of significant historical interest to any party operating in the outer Kethavar region and is recommended for formal survey scheduling at the earliest available rotation." The Colonial Authority Records Division acknowledged receipt of the archive on a Friday. They flagged it as Priority Tier 1 archaeological material, which is the highest priority classification in the registry, and notified the Academic Consortium for Outer Passage Cultural History within 6 hours. The consortium notified me directly, through my survey station address, that a dedicated translation team was being assembled. They asked if I would be willing to consult. I said yes. The Heritage Infrastructure designation was approved 9 days later. The 47 towers of the relay network are now listed in the Colonial Authority Cultural Preservation Registry as active heritage infrastructure, which means that no survey operation, extraction operation, or settlement activity may interfere with them without a review process that will, in practical terms, take longer than most commercial interests are willing to wait. The network will continue to broadcast. Earth, at least, will know it is there. I am still on the Karev's passage. We resumed the scheduled survey rotation after the deviation, and the rotation has another 4 months to run. And there are rocky bodies in the Kethavar corridor that need to be mapped and documented because that is what a geological survey vessel does. I map and document them. I maintain the passive receive array. I monitor the signal from the relay network, which reaches us clearly even now that we have moved back into the corridor, even at 11 light-years. Because the network was built to reach 11 light-years and has been doing so for 41,000 years and is not likely to stop for our survey rotation. I listen to it sometimes when the mapping work is quiet. 9 hours and 14 minutes, plus or minus 11 milliseconds. 3 layered subsequences, nested harmonics, frequency drift consistent with 41,000-year residual power operation. It is exactly what it has always been. It does not know we came. The broadcast is not designed to register acknowledgement. It is designed to reach, and it reaches. But the local record knows. The timestamp log knows. The acknowledgement I transmitted through the local interface on a day when the sky was flat and gray, and the wind moved the ground cover vegetation around the base of a 45-meter tower on a recovering world. That is in the record. It will still be in the record when the next party comes, whether that is in years or in another 40,000. There is one part of the archive that I have read in full, or as close to full as my current translation framework allows, and I read it before I read anything else. Because it was the part I needed to understand before I could think clearly about the rest. It was the final section of the record, not the last technical log, but the last entry that had the character of something a person had written, rather than a system had generated. It was the entry made by whoever had supervised the construction and activation of the relay network. The last entry they made before the network went fully automated and they were gone. I could not read all of it. Roughly 60% of it translated incompletely with significant inference gaps. But the shape of it was clear enough. It was an account of the decision to build the network, and the reasoning behind it, and the thing that had motivated the work during the final period when the outcome was certain, and the work continued anyway. The word I am translating as that motivating thing is not quite right. The inference engine flags it as a term that combines something like hope with something like obligation, a sense that one is required to act in a certain way, not because the outcome is assured, but because the alternative is to have done nothing, and doing nothing is not available as a choice when you are the person standing at this particular moment with this particular ability. I have turned that over in my mind many times. It is the kind of word that only exists in a language built by people who faced a situation that required it. They had known, when they built the towers, that there was no reasonable expectation of timely response. They had known that whatever civilization might eventually receive the signal was almost certainly unknown to them, might not exist yet, might not develop for thousands of years. They had built the network anyway. They had built it because the alternative was silence, and they had decided, and this part came through the translation with unusual clarity, as though they had worked to make it clear, that silence was worse than broadcasting into a void, that a record lost was worse than a record sent, that a signal unanswered was better than a signal never sent, because at least the signal gave whoever came the possibility of knowing. At least the signal gave whoever came the possibility of knowing. I read that 3 times. I read it, and I thought about the 11 months I had spent listening, and the 4 months I had spent decoding the lower channel without quite knowing what I had, and the bearing report I had filed in a flat administrative tone on a Tuesday, in the 11th month of the rotation, and Captain Vane's decision to follow the bearing, and the 41,000-year timestamp counter. And the way the adapter Avesh built had fit cleanly enough into the interface that whoever designed the interface had clearly understood that an unknown species with unknown connectors would need to be able to use it. They had thought of everything they could think of. They had done everything they could do. And then they had trusted the rest to whoever came. We were the ones who came. Earth sent a small geological survey vessel and a junior cartographer who spent 11 months listening to a signal he was not assigned to monitor. We were not much, measured against what had been built and what had been waiting. We were not a fleet. We were not a rescue. We were, in the strictest sense, the wrong vessel for the job. A geological survey ship with a signal analysis package and a captain who was willing to follow a bearing. But we came. We connected. We received what was left. We put a timestamp on it. The towers are still broadcasting. Earth, at least, heard. I keep the monitoring channel open.